Well, welcome to a Frontline investigative series and a very interesting book and a very interesting author. Sonia Shah has written a very well-documented investigation of how big pharma, nay, bad pharma, has exported massive clinical testing to third world countries, where oversight is poor or often non-existent. The book documents a great deal of that, quite compellingly. The effects she describes are as startling, I think, as the profits. But let's go directly to her. She'll speak, and then we'll have questions and answers afterwards. But let me ask you first, what excited your interest?
This project started with a magazine article, actually, about the Trovan trial, which is an antibiotic that was trialed in Nigeria. And in the course of reporting on that scandal, which had already been broken in the news by the Washington Post, I realized that this was just a much bigger story and that there was clearly a book in it. Having worked in book publishing for 8 to 10 years, I knew there was a book in it because it just, to look at the trend of the drug industry taking these experiments overseas, you needed to sort of move beyond reporting on scandals. You know, you can always just do this scandal and that scandal and that scandal, but to really look at sort of what is the trend would require taking, looking at one trial or two trials or half a dozen and going over time sort of, prospectively. So, that would illustrate the trend in a way that anomalous scandals might not. So that's pretty much how it started. But just to tell you a little bit about the book as well, it's, essentially about this business of experimenting on humans, which isn't a new thing by any stretch of the imagination. The ancient Greeks performed live dissections on prisoners and on poor people, and those sort of fair-like spectacle. But today, this business of experimenting on humans is truly vast. Around the world, drug companies are doing tens of thousands of clinical trials on human subjects. Each new drug today requires over 4,000 patients enrolled in clinical trials. And since so many people drop out over time, et cetera, that requires 100,000 people to actually call in for screenings for these trials. So it's really a kind of a huge activity that's going on. And there's, of course, those 3 phases of trials where the first phase is in humans looking at sort of, is this drug safe for healthy people? If it passes through that hurdle, then it goes on to phase 2 trials where it's sort of looking at safety and effectiveness to some degree in a slightly larger sample, but not a huge number of people. And then the phase 3 trials, which is when they have to prove with statistical certainty that this drug actually works for something. And those are the trials where sometimes thousands and tens of thousands of patients are required. And that's partially because lots of new drugs aren't highly effective. So, for example, if you had to prove with statistical certainty that insulin worked for somebody in a diabetic coma, you wouldn't need that many people because the difference between someone who got the insulin and someone who didn't get the insulin would be so huge. You could see it right away. But a lot of new drugs have a very slight level of effectiveness compared to, say, no drug at all or existing drugs. So that means you need lots and lots of people. The other issue is that a lot of the new drugs today, because we've become such healthy people, really, I mean, in the West, in the big Western markets, we've conquered a lot of the infectious diseases that used to plague us in the past. So what drug companies are really aiming at are these sort of chronic, slow-moving diseases like heart disease, arthritis, things like that. And so, to show that a drug worked when, say, your end point is how many people get heart attacks on drug A compared to drug B, well, if you only have 100 people, you're going to have to wait a damn long time to get enough heart attacks to show your drug worked. So that's another reason why so many people are required. And in the United States, for example, which is the biggest drug market in the world, the average American takes home 10 prescriptions every year. Only 1 out of 20 are actually willing to be part of a clinical trial, say, to be the guinea pig for the experimental drug that's going to be the next blockbuster. And those two facts are not unrelated. The more we have access to drugs that work, the less willing we are to take part in experimental drugs, to expose ourselves to that risk. So drug makers are spending around $1,500 to find and retain each trial subject in their trials, and even so, they're failing to recruit enough people for their trials 4 out of 5 times. So this is sort of a major business problem in the drug industry, and it's something that they're all kind of agonizing over, having conferences, writing papers, et cetera. There's consultants who are selling very expensive workshops trying to tackle this issue because it's not just sort of an inconvenience and a delay, but every day that your drug is sort of locked up in research and development means sort of $1 million lost in lost sales that you could have had it gotten there first. And a lot of the drug companies are really sort of neck and neck, always competing to be the first to market with the new inhaled insulin drug or the new blockbuster antidepressant or whatever. And so, in fact, in some cases, drug companies actually recruit more people than they need for their trials just to deprive their competitors of sufficient numbers of subjects who have the disease they're looking for. So what's happened over the last decade or so is, and this has all happened very, very quietly, drug companies have started exporting this business of human experimentation overseas, where that ratio between the number of drugs people take and their willingness to be in clinical trials is reversed. So you have a lot of people who have very poor access to new drugs and who are therefore much more willing to be part of these clinical trials. For example, GlaxoSmithKline, Wyeth, and Merck are going to be conducting half or even more of their clinical trials for new drugs outside of the United States and Western Europe this year. And of course, that's also reliant on the fact that in developing countries today, there's been this huge sort of disease transition. Whereas if, 20 years ago or 30 years ago, where the burden of disease in those countries was mostly, say, malaria or tuberculosis or sleeping sickness, these so-called tropical diseases, there wouldn't be a lot of interest in doing these trials in these countries, but in a lot of the developing world, all the same diseases that we're suffering in the West are also present there. And indeed, 75% of the deaths from non-communicable chronic diseases, that is heart disease, diabetes, hypertension, are not in the West but in developing countries. But in most of those countries, few people actually are being treated for those conditions. So, that's sort of a public health problem of staggering proportions according to the WHO. But what it means for drug trials is there's more, quote-unquote, events that happen faster. For example, if in your trial you need to see how many people die of their cancer, well, if people are going to be having those outcomes more often because of the background level of malnutrition and exposure to toxins or whatever, then you're going to finish your trial a lot faster. And this is something that the contract research industry, which is sort of this middleman industry that does these clinical trials for drug companies, actually promotes that, come to Poland because people die of cancer at a lot younger age. From the time from diagnosis to death is much faster, or the rate of growth is much faster, or the time to heart attack is much faster. So these are ways that trials in these countries are much more rapid. And the other point is that a lot of these patients are what's called treatment naive. And that's sort of an ironic term. It's not used ironically. But what it means is that they've never had any medical care for their conditions. And that's, it's sad for them on one hand, but for drug trials, those kinds of people are in really high demand. Because the problem in the West is you can't tell what your drug has done to person A. Or say you get your results and then you go to the Drug Regulatory Authority and say, here are my results. 10 people got cancer without my drug, and 4 people got it, didn't get it when they had my drug. And the regulatory authority says, well, all those people were also taking aspirin and a cholesterol drug and doing this and that and the other thing. So they're sort of, and it really complicates the results. It's much harder to see how did your drug actually work in this human being because so many of them have other drugs that are happening in their body already. So those treatment naive patients are really key in drug trials. And, of course, that has to do with the global drug market, which, of course, multinational drug companies have also obviously had a role in. So, what I try to show in the book is sort of the potential for exploitation and human rights violations, which I think is really visceral. For example, informed consent. informed consent is sort of the cornerstone of ethical research, that the person who you're experimenting on understands what you're doing and has agreed to do it, and that should be voluntary. It shouldn't be done under coercive conditions. So, for example, in World War II, after World War II, when the Nazi doctors were tried at Nuremberg, that's when that idea first emerged. That, and they said, well, these people are going to die anyway. So, what did it matter that we did these experiments? And that was sort of their justification, is it wasn't any worse than what was going to happen to them anyway. But out of that trial came this sort of cornerstone of it must be voluntary. The consent can't be done under coercive conditions. And it needs to be, they need to understand that this is an experiment, that this isn't treatment. This is something that's experimental, and that's why we're doing the experiment. We don't know if it's going to work. And it unfortunately isn't an area that sort of medical anthropologists have looked at that closely. But in the few studies that have been done are pretty alarming. For example, in one study in Thailand, what they do is they go to trials that have already been conducted, or already are ongoing. So everybody has been consented into the trial. They've gone through, a Q&A session with someone in the trial, and they've signed all the legal papers saying, yes, I understand, yes, I consent, et cetera, et cetera. And then after they do that, they're in the trial. Then these other researchers come in and give them little questionnaires. I mean, it's very simple. It's just a little quiz, and inside the quiz is all these questions about, are you going to be helped by this trial? Do you understand? All these sort of things that they should have been informed about. In this Thai study, for example, 30 out of 33 flunked that quiz. In a contraceptive study in Brazil, all the enrolled subjects flunked that quiz. In an HIV transmission study in Haiti, 80% flunked that quiz. That is misunderstanding the basic outlines of the trial. That is not informed consent. And unfortunately, the quality of informed consent, even in Western trials, is often found to be quite lacking. And there's a whole psychology of that where, there's these interesting studies of people who are in trials, and they ask them, well, what are the chances that, a person in this trial is going to get the experimental drug versus the placebo? And people will say, oh, it's 50-50. We know that, right? Then they ask another question, which makes it more interesting. What are your chances of getting the experimental drug or placebo? Oh, well, if it's me, my chances are 80-20. So there's this sort of psychology of wanting it to work, this hope, this what is called as a therapeutic misconception. So informed consent isn't always ideal even in Western societies. But the other part of it that's sort of unique to poor countries is voluntariness. That is, do they understand that they are free to leave this trial whenever they want? There's no coercion here, right? And how can we tell that subjects are actually voluntarily consenting to a trial? Well, the general way that that's indicated is look at how many people drop out. In Western trials, usually 15 to 45%, sometimes even more than that, over time will drop out because they had a side effect or, they lost interest, whatever the reason is. But that sort of post-factum confirmation that, yes, they knew they were free to leave the trial because, well, they just did. And that's something that I think is really worryingly lacking in a lot of the trials that are happening in poor countries. Some of these contract research organizations, Quintiles, for example, which is one of the biggest ones in the world, claim that they've recruited 3,000 patients in 9 days at a time in South Africa. They've recruited over 1,300 kids in 12 days, also in South Africa. And, that really suggests sort of a startling lack of anybody saying no. And indeed, when the National Bioethics Advisory Committee, which is sort of a government advisory committee in the United States, they did an anonymous survey of investigators who are active in developing countries, and 45% of them said that the people they approach to be in these trials never say no, which is really quite remarkable. And again, when these sociologists have looked back at people who are already in trials and quizzed them, in one very interesting study done in South Africa, all the subjects were found to be informed. They knew it was an experiment. They knew their chances were 50-50, et cetera, et cetera. They knew it wasn't designed to help them, so they were very informed. But 80% of them said that they were not aware they were free to leave. So they felt that if they left, they would get no more health care at that site. So essentially, their consent was informed, but non-voluntary. And similar results have been obtained in other places, such as Bangladesh. And so the choice is essentially be experimented on, or be deprived of health care, or suffer death even, which is effectively no choice at all. So that's sort of an alarming phenomenon that I found. But the other part of it is that these contract research companies, these drug trials companies like Quintiles, and there's many, many others, sort of promote that unduly positive response as a reason to do more trials in those countries, not less. So they promote on their websites or with their brochures that they give to potential clients in the drug industry, saying things like, well, when we do our trials in India, we retain 99.5% of our patients. So nobody drops out. Essentially, nobody drops out. This is a quote from a very typical article in a journal called Applied Clinical Trials. It was called Discover Russia for Clinical Research. Quote, Russian subjects don't miss appointments, and only very rarely do they withdraw their consent. What a phenomenon! Exclamation point. In China, a CRO in China similarly said, quote, the Chinese are not that fully emancipated as in the U.S. They are more willing to be guinea pigs. And these aren't considered reasons not to do trials there, because, of course, this is indications of non-voluntariness, which is against sort of our cornerstone of ethical principles in medical research. On the contrary, these are reasons to do more trials there because it's faster. The other sort of glaring problem that I saw is just the lack of oversight of these trials. In the U.S. and here in the EU as well, there's no sort of ongoing oversight. There's no prior review. For example, if you wanted to do an experiment on humans in Britain, you would have to get approval from the MHRA first, and they would look over your plans and et cetera, and same with the FDA in the United States, which is the counterpart of the MHRA. They would say, well, let me see your animal data. Let me see how safe this is. What are your plans for these people that you're going to experiment on? How are you going to conduct the experiment? All these things. So that would happen before the trial even was able to start. Then once it started, there'd be an ethics committee, sort of an independent body that would oversee the trial over time and make sure subjects are being protected over time. But once you cross the border, things are very different. Since 1987, the FDA in the U.S. has accepted data from trials that are conducted outside of the U.S., but it doesn't require that drug companies alert the agency before they start those trials, and nor does the MHRA or the EU Clinical Trials Directive, which are aimed at trials conducted only in sort of the member states. So if those trials overseas, so if a drug maker says, well, I'm going to go test my drug in Nigeria or in Zambia or South Africa or India, well, they don't have to tell anybody here, even if they're going to eventually use that data here. And then if those trials fail, and keep in mind that 90% of drugs that enter into clinical trials do fail to get marketing approval. So if those trials fail and are not used, not brought back to the regulatory authorities in the West, in the Western markets, then essentially nobody knows about them. They're not published. They're not reviewed by any government entities in the West, and they literally just vanish. So, in effect, we do have, on paper, we do have ethical codes that are supposed to be met on all these trials. The Declaration of Helsinki, for example, which is written by the World Medical Association and, is enshrined into FDA rules as well as in the EU Clinical Trials Directive. And essentially what that means is the ethics committees done locally at the local site have to ensure that all of these protections are being met, all of these ethical standards are being met. Also, local rules have to be followed. Any local laws have to be followed. So it's not like just carte blanche that you go there. Of course, there's national regulations and all the rest of it. But the trouble is to sort of pass on all of the burden of protecting research subjects to the local regulators and the local ethics committees is really insufficient, because in a lot of these countries there's very weak regulatory infrastructure to begin with. There's not a lot of ethics training. I mean, the ethics committees work in the West because we have legalized this idea of patient rights, and we have a long tradition of sort of ethical practice. And even if we don't meet them all the time, we have codes of ethics sort of inside our medical associations. We have ongoing licensing of physicians and punitive actions if people sort of fail to meet those codes of ethics. In India, for example, which is one place I did some of my reporting from, Pfizer, Glaxo, AstraZeneca are all sort of rushing to India now, and they have these gleaming buildings in downtown Bombay. Government officials in India have said that they want to increase the drug trials business in that country from $70 million a year to $1 billion a year. And so they've made all these changes in their laws to sort of ease this practice. They've exempted experimental drugs from customs duties. Phase 3 trials don't have to be completed elsewhere before launching in India. So all these previous barriers that they did have in the past have been stripped away. Companies that invest in R&D in India actually get 10-year tax concessions and things like that. And this is seen as sort of a good business move for India. The Economic Times is one of the leading business papers, and they wrote in an editorial quote, "The opportunities are huge. The multinationals are eager. The Indian companies are willing. We have the skills. We have the people. We have an advantage, which China doesn't and probably never will." And that's probably referring to the fact that English is spoken. "Best of all, this is one sort of outsourcing which American workers aren't likely to protest," unquote. So this is considered good business. But on the other hand, while they've relaxed a lot of regulations to allow more clinical trials into the country, they haven't strengthened protections and regulations on drug industry and clinical practice and for research subjects otherwise. Today I was in an interview with Richard Tyner from the British pharmaceutical sort of trade industry association, and he was saying how, well, in India, they have the same system as the British system, so it must be all really, good and high standard. And that's, of course, true. And as a disclaimer, both of my parents are physicians from India, so I'm not saying that in India it's not possible to get a really great medical education and to become a really ethical clinician, but you can't rely on the system of governance and regulation to ensure that. As of 2003, when I was last there was no medical school in the country that taught a course on medical ethics. Actually, when I was there, medical school, there's this whole scandal in the papers of medical schools actually selling medical degrees. And once you get a medical degree in India, you don't have to prove any ongoing competence like you do in Western countries. There's no sort of continuing medical education where if you don't sort of keep up, your license is revoked. So once you get it, you're good to go forever, pretty much. The Indian Medical Association doesn't have a code of ethics that it requires for its members. So, for example, in Surat, when the plague broke out, 2/3 of the physicians in that city fled. Which is a huge abrogation of their responsibility to patients, considering that plague, very scary, of course, but can be treated with antibiotics. And this came out in the paper. It wasn't an unknown thing, but none of these physicians were penalized by the Indian Medical Association or any other body. The drugs industry is sort of notoriously unregulated in India. There was one study that was done that showed that they do a lot of drug combinations there, because there's lots of sort of small-scale pharmaceutical manufacturing going on there. over 70 of these drug combinations were actually found to be either useless or actively dangerous, but they continue to be sold under over 1,000 different brand names. Drugs are sold for things like intellectual decay and social maladjustment, deterioration in behavior. I mean, these things that sort of, indicate a lack of sort of scientific review of how these drugs are being sold. A 2003 magazine investigation, actually, they collected a whole bunch of drugs that were just available in their local market and had them tested in a lab. 1 out of 4 were found to be substandard, that is chalk or, some other inert substance. And the press in India is very lively. So all of this stuff really comes out a lot. It's not that it's secret, but there's very little is actually done about it. In one of the leading industry analysts in India, Chandra Guhati, said, well, even if an airing company is caught red-handed indulging in illegal activities, it is let off with a light warning. And he gives no real explanation for that. I talked to a lot of people who sit on ethics committees in India who are overseeing these clinical trials, and they said, there's really no ethics culture in the profession. I mean, doctors will openly say, and this has actually been printed in, academic papers, that, Indian physicians are against informed consent because their patients want doctors who tell them what to do. The whole idea, the whole way that we think of doing these trials ethically is sort of subverted in that scenario. So he was saying there's really no ethics culture in the profession, and that these committees are really put together just to enable clearance, because you need somebody to sort of sign on the dotted line. It's usually the chairperson of the clinic or hospital who you go to the meeting and just literally just signs off on things. So there's been this whole range of transgressions in medical research in India, none of which is secret either. It's very well documented. In the 1980s, for example, there was an injectable contraceptive. It had already been withdrawn from the market. It was tested on villagers who later said they had no idea they were participating in a trial. In a leprosy trial sponsored by the government over the 1990s, subjects were uninformed that the trial was placebo-controlled. So, they all thought they were getting some active treatment or drug there. In the late 90s, and this was sort of similar to the Tuskegee syphilis study in the United States, government researchers studied over 1,100 illiterate women who had precancerous lesions on their cervixes, didn't tell them what they had found, and sort of watched how their disease progressed over time, and that was a natural history study. And those subjects did not know that they were part of any kind of study. Later on, it was revealed. Just over the last few years, Johns Hopkins researcher was caught testing an experimental cancer drug on cancer patients, and this person had never even done any animal tests to prove the drug was even safe, let alone effective, let alone safe for human use. Just recently, also an experimental cancer drug was given to over 400 women in some sort of strange fertility experiment, and the drug, which should have been known beforehand, was toxic to embryos. Western countries have had our own share of transgressions, and I talk about this a bit in the book. In the United States, for example, in the whole era before research subject protections were enshrined into law, there was sort of widespread abuses, even after we had articulated the ethical way to do these trials. That first articulation right after World War II in the Nuremberg Code, so that's on the books by the 1940s. Well, come around 1972, we hear suddenly about this trial that's been going on since the 40s on black sharecroppers in Alabama who thought they had bad blood, were never told that what they actually had was syphilis, which is contagious. This is, of course, before penicillin was available, penicillin being, the treatment of choice for syphilis. And the government researchers who did this trial sort of tricked them into being in the study. They said they were getting free medical treatment. So they never revealed to these sharecroppers, these black men, that they were in an experiment, essentially. Watch them over time, over decades. And when penicillin, and gave them arsenic injections and mercury, which were sort of outdated, quite toxic treatments for syphilis. When penicillin came on the market, instead of giving these patients penicillin, because the point of the study was to see how syphilis progresses, and there was also a racist overtone to that. They wanted to see how syphilis progresses in the black male. So they already knew how it happens in white people. That had been done in a study in Northern Europe, actually, a natural history study. And so they wanted to see how does this work in black men. So there's this idea that there's some sort of biological racial difference that they were trying to discern. So when penicillin came online, here they have all these people, these men who are suffering syphilis, unknowingly spreading it, because this is a contagious disease. They're transmitting it to their wives, to their lovers. Their wives are giving it to the babies, etc. It's going on. They conspired with the local draft boards, local clinicians, the physicians in the area to not give any of the people enrolled in the Tuskegee syphilis study any penicillin. In fact, it didn't work. In fact, a lot of these men ended up getting treated, ended up getting penicillin because they did get drafted and they did see other doctors and things like that. So the whole study was just scientifically completely invalidated by the end of it. But interestingly, this study was not a secret. There was papers written about this study, presentations given at conferences about this study every few years from the beginning. So from the 1930s when it started. So for decades. Not until 1972 when someone at the Public Health Service, which was the government agency that was in charge of that trial, told a reporter about that trial. And it broke in the New York Times, and all hell broke loose. And suddenly, this trial that had been going on forever, everyone knew about it. And so suddenly, after that, we finally got these legal protections on the books for research subjects. So all of these voluntary codes, the Declaration of Helsinki had already been written, the Nuremberg Code had already been written, and universally accepted that this is the way we do things. Yes, indeed, yes, of course, we write it in our codes of ethics, and we publish it every year, and et cetera, et cetera. We give it to our medical students, but in fact, the government itself had been doing this trial that clearly violated many of the principles for so long. So when we leave it sort of up to the research community to police itself, we can see that even in Western countries where there is this well-established regulatory infrastructure, a well-established sense of ethics, et cetera, supposedly in place, even then we see these widespread violations. And Tuskegee was sort of the most famous. The other ones that had came out right around that time, a really infamous study where, and this was actually a famous trial that led to lots of scientific breakthroughs in hepatitis, where at an orphanage, this Saul Krugman, the name of the physician, and I think he was awarded some really prestigious awards later for his research. He was looking into how hepatitis is transmitted from person to person. So he actually purposely infected these boys at this orphanage with hepatitis, and the way he did that was with hepatitis-infected fecal matter. And he dried it out, and he mixed it in with chocolate milk, and he fed it to these orphans, and who then got sick, and he tracked how it transmitted. This is the kid I gave the chocolate milk to. This is the kid I didn't. What happened between them? This one got it, that one didn't. So that's how the chain of transmission in hepatitis and the different strains of hepatitis were first discerned, through that kind of research. And Krugman is sort of a hero in the medical research world. I mean, his science is considered exemplary, but of course it was violating all kinds of voluntary codes of ethics. It was only after the United States Congress passed the National Research Act in 1974 that all of that stuff sort of came to a crashing halt. And in India, so it's not to say that only India has had these, or only these poor countries have had these horrible transgressions occurring. It's happened in the West as well. It's just in the U.S. at least we've seen that it has at least led to, after the fact, too late to help a lot of people, the people who suffered before, but at least we have them on the books now, some legal protections and legally enshrined oversight. And that's really what's lacking in these countries. So when the drug companies are saying, well, we're obeying all the local rules and we have local oversight. Well, if oversight and rules are all voluntary, then essentially we're allowing researchers to police themselves, and even the most well-meaning ones can run astray of ethical standards. And partially that's because, there's a real sort of cognitive dissonance, I think, in doing these trials and I spoke to a lot of clinicians who do these trials in South Africa and India, and, they said, look, they're working in this sort of underfunded clinics and hospitals. Their patients can't afford a lot of care. A big drug company comes and says, look, test our new arthritis drug. We'll give you this new machine, and we'll pay you all this money, certain thousands of rupees per person you recruit into this trial, major incentives. And so when their patients come in and qualify for the trial, they say, look, this is great. I'm doing something good for this patient. This patient can't afford any care. At least if I can get this patient into this experiment, they'll get sort of ongoing care, even if it's not for the disease they're sick with. It's going, they're going to be getting aspirin. They're going to be getting care for their malaria. They're going to be getting sort of ongoing medical supervision, if nothing else. And that's better than what they had before. So the feeling that's happening on the ground is, even for the patients, is, well, this is better than what I had. And for the clinicians, it's, I'm doing the best I can for my patients. So I think there's a real sort of cognitive dissonance in how it's perceived. I mean, the Constant Gardener actually complicated this a lot, the movie of the John le Carré novel, which I don't know if anyone here has seen it, but it's this woman, and she sort of uncovers this unethical trial in an African country, and it's this big conspiracy, and she ends up losing her life over it, as does her partner. And what's interesting about that is they sort of portrayed it as this shady, dangerous business, and in a way it is that, but in a way it really isn't, because on the ground, when you look at these trials, nobody's ashamed. None of the people I talked to were ashamed of what they were doing. Even if people were, just dying to be in their trials and they're having queues around the corner, even if it was for a placebo trial, even if it was for a placebo trial that had been damned as unethical in a Western country, they still felt this was a good trial for us to do. So they weren't trying to cover it up. Like, when I actually approached them, they were open about talking about it. So, so the dangerousness isn't about getting that story out at all. But then the defenses that the drug industry has for all of these sort of, slipping and sliding with the ethical standards we have on the books. Now, it's okay to say, look, we disagree with that ethical standard. Maybe we don't want to say all informed consent has to be voluntary. Maybe we want it to be more like working in a garment factory, working in a sweatshop. That's not a great job. Nobody's saying that's a great job, but for some people it is. Right? So let's go send it to Taiwan. Now, is that a coercive situation if you offer some person living in poverty some crappy job that you would never take? Is that exploitation, or is that offering an opportunity? Is that a coercive situation, or is it voluntary? Well, maybe we want to think of experimentation in the same way, but the fact is, what we have in our books and in our ethical codes that have been enshrined into law is this idea of voluntary informed consent. And that means a situation that's not coercive. And I look in the book at several other ethical precepts that are routinely violated, and we can sort of maybe talk about that more in the Q&A if people are interested. But just one final note is that drug companies say, and not just drug companies, but a lot of the clinical researchers who do sort of public health-oriented research as well say, well, yes, there are all these complications and problems, but this great promise of biomedical research, really outweighs all of those risks. Like, yes, sure, some people may be coerced, maybe they got a placebo, it could have done better, blah, blah, blah. But, if we stop doing this, medical innovation will sort of come to a crashing halt and people will die. So if you are saying, let's put more regulations, let's slow down, you have blood on your hands, essentially, is sort of the line from that. And I think that's a very, very powerful argument that has kept a lot of people quiet about what they see as transgressions in these clinical trials. But it's also not a very fair argument. If you go to any tropical country and you see a warehouse of high-tech vaccines rotting in the tropical sun, unused, you realize that research alone does not lead to this great promise of medical research. The great promise of medical research we get when we implement the results. The results alone don't equal the progress. We can know everything we want to know about malaria. We know how to prevent malaria. We know how to cure malaria. Well, why is there 500 million cases of malaria every year still? That's not a problem of research. It's a problem of implementation. And that really requires, obviously, the commitment of lots of people, not just researchers alone. And it's also actually, to be honest, an area that a lot of researchers are frankly not that interested in doing. They're interested in doing the research part of it and saying, well, all of that sort of application stuff, that's for somebody else to do. Well, that's fine, if you want to separate it. But then you can't say, look, go ahead and take on this burden of risks in the experiments I'm doing because these other people are going to implement all my research. That's really sort of a step removed. And I guess the other point, actually one last point to end with, it would be fairly straightforward to make these trials more just, and we can talk about that a little bit more in the Q&A. But I also just want to add that it's more than a human rights issue for me. It's more than an issue of us not meeting the ethical standards that we've already outlined for ourselves. It's also sort of a public health issue more generally because I think there's really this crisis of trust that's growing in a lot of poor countries today about Western medicine. In Nigeria, the polio vaccine was rejected as poison. In South Africa, there's still government officials who say HIV doesn't cause AIDS. Just recently in Cambodia, in Cameroon, and Thailand, an HIV prevention trial was scuttled because people felt like it was exploitative of them. So, having this sort of general sense of exploitation is only going to get inflamed as this boom takes its course. And the thing that's really going to be on the line is not the drug trials that the industry runs because those are quite secretive and quite quiet. But the public health research, the people who are looking for a malaria vaccine, for an AIDS vaccine, for new drugs for tuberculosis, who are doing their experiments in Nigeria and Ghana and Malawi and all the rest of it, they're the ones who are really sort of out there. They're the ones who are most vulnerable to the heat that comes up when this sort of sense of exploitation at the hands of the white-coated Westerners sort of takes hold.
Okay, thank you. Any questions? When you're talking about the reluctance of people to participate in these tests, curiously, it would appear from your book, at least, that a large number of Americans and Brits don't want to participate in these tests either. Why is that?
That's right. Only 1 out of 20 Americans participates in clinical trials. So 4 out of 5, 80% of clinical trials that are conducted in Western countries actually fail to meet their deadlines to recruit enough people. And, that's something that sort of the whole industry is in agony over, like trying to figure out why. Some people say it's because, well, they already have enough access to drugs that work. So why should I give up my arthritis drug that I know works to be in some trial and get some experimental drug that might, hurt or might not work as well, whatever, something like that. The other part of it is a lot of drug companies want to do placebo trials. They want to test their new drug against nothing because that's an easier standard, and it also still proves that your drug works, because to prove your drug works, you just have to prove it works better than nothing. You don't have to prove that Celebrex is better than Vioxx. A new arthritis drug is better than the old arthritis drug. That's not necessary to do, although here in Europe, it's more of the case that drug companies do want to do that because the regulatory authorities like it. But in the FDA in the U.S., the biggest drug market in the world, the FDA has very openly and vociferously said they prefer placebo trials. So where do you do those placebo trials? There's literally very few people in the West who are willing to be in a placebo trial today.
Yeah. Hold on a second. Could you identify yourself and use the microphone?
Sure, no problem. Lindsay McGoy, I'm a PhD student here in London. 2 quick questions. You just touched on the first one, actually. As you know, it's not simply the dearth of human research subjects that's led in part to the outsourcing, but the problem that certain provisions in the Declaration of Helsinki, such as the provision against placebo controls in the West, that has led in part to the outsourcing in the attempt to find more subjects for placebo-controlled trials. So your comment, which I wholeheartedly agree, and there needs to be more of an attention to the fact that developing countries are not enforcing some of the provisions in the code, is true, but it's in part the enforcement of the code in the West that has led to the outsourcing. So we need to sort of unpack that direct correlation a bit more. Second, quick question. I fear a little bit that in order to stress the profundity of the problem in the West, you've painted a slightly auspicious picture of the regulatory systems here in Britain and the U.S. You did cite some historical examples of transgression, but as I'm sure you know from your conversation today with people like Richard Tyner, the MHRA is 100% funded by the pharmaceutical industry and has been since Thatcher deregulated it in the 1980s. As a follow-up project, I'd be really curious if you're going to start sort of investigating some of the examples of regulatory inefficacy here in the West, which might be interesting.
I think that's a great topic. I mean, I do a chapter in my book on informed consent in the West and how troublingly scarce it actually is when people look at it, and how the therapeutic misconception, I mean, the idea that experimentation is therapy is so widespread in the West, and there's companies that are openly saying, come to our trial because this is another treatment option for you. Well, it's not, And there also is this growing sense in the United States that experimentation is somehow now this right that people have. For example, the Institute of Medicine, which is one of the National Academies of Science, a government advisory body, one of the biggest and most esteemed advisory bodies to the national government in the United States, recently came out with a report saying we should lift the ban on experimentation on prisoners because prisoners have a right to be in clinical trials. Well, where did this come from? Nobody has a right to be in an experiment. We have a right to treatment that works. This idea, and I think it's sort of a holdover from AIDS activist days where, in the early days of AIDS activism where there were no treatments and people say, look, you need to give us these experimental drugs. We have a right to it. And I think that's sort of been co-opted by the FDA even. When I've talked to the FDA in the United States a lot about this issue, and, and they'll openly say, like, yeah, we can't look at informed consent that closely. I mean, I won't tell you it's done well, and it's sort of like, okay, this is something everyone says is the cornerstone of doing research ethically, but our premier regulatory agency is saying they're not even looking at it closely. And indeed, a lot of these trials that I looked at where the Helsinki provisions were clearly violated, in my mind, from a layperson's perspective, clearly violated, were approved by the FDA. I mean, even the most famous one, the Trovan trial in Nigeria, which is the subject of a class action suit, because all those Nigerians who were part of that trial said, we didn't know it was an experiment. I mean, huge problems with informed consent. The ethics committee approval was backdated, so there was no ethics committee at the time. There was no informed consent forms written. There was no witnessing of the verbal consent that supposedly happened. So there's all kinds of problems. Well, Pfizer sent all that data to the FDA, and the FDA approved that drug. None of those issues came out till the press got to it years later. So I think that's a clear indication that the FDA is not really looking, not really ensuring that any of its own ethical codes are being met, and in fact have been backing away. As I'm sure you know, in 2001, the FDA said, the World Medical Association actually revised the Declaration of Helsinki to sort of strengthen protections for research subjects in placebo trials, to sort of limit the times when you can actually do a placebo trial experimentally. And the FDA raised a huge hue and cry about it and said, no, we can't, we're not going to be part of this anymore. We're not going to put it. Every time the Declaration of Helsinki had been revised over the years, the FDA promptly sort of incorporated the new version into their codes. But starting in 2001, they said, no, that's it. We're not even taking that on. So the FDA is not party to the 2001 revision of the Declaration of Helsinki. In 2004, the FDA proposed dropping Helsinki from its codes altogether and replacing it. And the Declaration of Helsinki is not a perfect document, but it's 32 principles, and they're quite philosophical. They're open to interpretation, but it's all about protecting patients. It's all about doing research ethically. The FDA said, no, scratch that, because that's created by an international body, and the U.S., this U.S. exceptionalism thing where we can't be part of anything that's sort of an international effort anymore. So it's really part of this whole movement that's happening under George Bush. But in any case, oh no, I said George Bush, and my head just went into a tiz, and I can't remember what I was saying anymore. But anyway, and they said drop the declaration of Helsinki, instead replace it by these technical rules called good clinical practice. Well, that sounds really good, but who writes the good clinical practice rules? The FDA, PhRMA, which is the trade association of the pharmaceutical manufacturers of the United States, and their counterparts here in Europe, in the International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers, and regulatory authorities from Japan and Western Europe. So it's the people in this club, and as it seems like you were just sort of alluding to, at least, and it's the same thing in the U.S. The FDA is full of pharmaceutical executives, and pharmaceutical companies are full of former FDA executives. So it's really sort of a revolving door.
Hi there. My name's Ray Dawkins from Frontier Television. Do you think that if all regulations on clinical trials were abandoned, that we would suddenly have a flood of amazing new drugs because there would be no limits on the experimentation?
Well, they wouldn't be amazing. No, I don't think so, because we wouldn't know whether they worked. I mean, before 1930s, drug companies didn't have to prove their drugs worked for anything. Before 1962, after the thalidomide disaster, that drug companies actually had to prove that their drugs did something. Before that, they just had to say, well, it's not poison, So the main drugs that were on the market back then, I mean, we can just look historically, at your proposed scenario before those regulations. Well, the main drugs that were on the market were cocaine and heroin. The opiates were the main ingredients in all of our blockbuster drugs. And antibiotics, of course, which were often dissolved in opiate-like substances.
But most of the major classes of drugs were discovered really before really intense regulation of the clinical trials. Not much seems to have come out since we've had this very severe regulation. I mean, it's not my point of view. This is an argument that's been put forward.
Well, I think there's some merit to that. I mean, aspirin, penicillin, some of our major drugs are sort of botanicals that were just quinine discovered hundreds of years ago even. But certainly the drug, advances in heart disease treatments and cancer treatments, I mean, these are incremental progress that the drug industry and public health researchers have definitely achieved, I think, in the era of regulation, and also just the faith with which we can use drugs today because of our stronger regulations, that we know that this drug works, we can use it with some sort of confidence, and we can prescribe it with confidence because of regulation. So regulation, I think, has really helped the drug industry a lot.
Hi, I'm Mike Gallagher, freelance journalist. What about Gulf War syndrome and the allegations behind that? I mean, guys were given cocktails of drugs prior to 1991.
Yeah, they've overridden all of the informed consent rules for people in the military. So the people in the military are subjected to all kinds of experimental procedures, and there's been some really good documentation of all of those various state experiments on the military already, including the recent one, and throughout in the past. I mean, testing malaria, like so-called malaria vaccines, and psychotropic drugs even, and testing radiation exposures. I mean, all those things have been documented in the past because those informed consent rules don't necessarily apply to people in the military.
Michael Gilligan. I'm interested, is there any difference between what these drug companies are doing in developing countries in relation to conventional medicines and the new types of genetic therapies that are coming out? Have you done any research on that?
No, not really, actually, in terms of the new gene therapies and things. No, and I mean, there's this whole idea in the drug industry, parts of the drug industry, that this is going to be the new thing, pharmacogenetics, where we're going to have individually tailored drugs for each person. But, personally, I don't really see how the market incentives will work because already, drug companies have said openly that if we don't have a $100 million market for sales, then we can't afford to develop a drug, because it takes that long to do it and it's that expensive and we need that profit margin, et cetera, et cetera. So how that would work in the era of pharmacogenomics is really kind of hazy to me.